All right. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places and filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse of every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. All right. So, for those that were here last week, what can you tell me about what we discussed?
One point I sort of remember is he raises the question of how can we renounce this world while we're still in it?
Mm-hmm.
And he contrasts the unmarried people with the married people who have many more distractions in their lives. So I remember that. Um,
there were two purposes for renouncing. One was to become closer to God, or to bring God more into your heart, and the other is to realize how much of a sinner you are.
Mm-hmm. So part of it too is the idea of, are we running towards something or running away from something? And normally when we're talking about these sort of things, running away from something is problematic because you're just going to find it wherever you go. But what he's talking about in this case is running away from our sinful life to try to gain something different. So before we continue with step 2, of which I hope everyone was able to read so that they can give their perspectives, I'd like to read a little bit from Unseen Warfare, chapter 40. On no account, beloved, must you flee from what may be a chance for acquiring virtue. On the contrary, whenever such a chance offers itself, you should accept it with joy, regarding as best and most welcome such things as are unpleasant to your heart and evoke no sympathy in you. I predict that with God's help, you will actually do so if you engrave deeply in your mind the following thoughts. First, you should realize that the opportunity for virtue you meet with are the best means you can have for acquiring it, given you by God in answer to your prayer. Having formed a desire to gain virtue, you have, of course, prayed God to grant it to you, and in praying for it, you cannot avoid praying also for the methods and means of acquiring this gift. But God does not give, for instance, the virtue of patience without afflictions, nor the virtue of humility without humbling occasions of degradation and dishonor. So after your prayer about these virtues, he sends you corresponding opportunities. What are you doing then in running away and avoiding them? You reject God's help for which you prayed and mock the gift of God. So decide to welcome gladly the chances you meet for virtue, and the more gladly, the more difficulties they offer. For in such cases, our virtuous actions evoke great courage and reveal great moral strength. And through this, we make each time a considerable step forward on the path of virtue, which alone should be our constant aim. I should explain that here, in advising you to use the most important occasion to gain virtue, I do not mean to advise you to disregard the less important chances, or to miss them through neglecting them. No, you should never miss any of them, whether important or unimportant, in order to be working always for virtue. For instance, you should bear patiently not only blatant abuse and reviling, or if so happens blows, but even a scowling look and a scornful expression or a sharp word. Since such unimportant cases are more frequent, our right reactions have more chances of showing themselves, and so keep our moral strength in a constant state of tension, thus giving us enough force to behave as we should also on important occasions. If we disregard these opportunities, we weaken our moral strength and render it less capable of dealing with important occasions. Secondly, making firm in yourselves the conviction and faith that all things happen to us according to God's will and for our profit, so that we may gain thereby a certain spiritual fruit. Although we cannot suppose that some things, such as our sins and those of other people, are a direct result of the willed action of God. Yet even they do not happen without God's leave, as means of admonishing and humbling us. As regards suffering and afflictions which are our own fault, or due to the malice of others, God himself sends them, desiring us to suffer and be tormented by them, in order to gain the blessings of virtue, which we are bound to earn if we endure as we should the trial he has sent us. The same applies to other judgments of his, hidden from us, but doubtless right and blessed. Thus convinced that God himself wishes you to endure the hardships and grief which assails you, either arising from the evil natures of other people, or invited by your own wrong actions, you will cease to think and say, as some others do, "No, this does not come from God. It is unjust and criminal, and God does not want crime, and turns away with loathing from it and from those who commit it." By this they want to justify their lack of patience and the gusts of anger and feelings of revenge they feel at the sight of injustice. But in actual fact, the only thing they achieve is to rebel against God's ordinances and to attempt to cast off the life-saving cross imposed on them by God for their own good, instead of shouldering it with good heart, which would undoubtedly be pleasing to him. And what do they get? They cannot cast off their cross. They offend God, and they still gain no peace. On the contrary, to grief they add contention and useless irritation, and render their state unbearable. Whereas, if they had borne what happened with a good heart, they would have been at peace, and would have attracted God's benevolence, and would have eaten richly of the fruit of the Spirit. So make it a rule for yourself, when you meet with injustices, injuries, and attacks, pay no attention to them, however wrong your offenders may be, but keep your attention firmly on one thing alone, that God let this happen for your good, and that you will deprive yourself of this good if you admit impatience, irritation, or contention in connection with it. And do not try to analyze the exact reason why God has allowed this. Do you believe that God is always right and merciful? Then believe on this occasion too, he shows you justice and mercy, although you do not see how. And remember how the Lord blesses those who believe. Thus, blessed are those that have not seen and have yet believed. So, my beloved brothers and sisters in Christ, this parcel from Unseen Warfare, talking about how we are to see blessings and opportunities in our struggles, is important when we look at the second step of ridding ourselves of attachment rather. So before we continue, I'd like to offer the floor to anyone that has thoughts or feelings about what we have read thus far, and on step 2 in particular, in which they have read.
Well, right in that first paragraph,
Mm-hmm.
where it talks about, people who sincerely live in fear of death. And then if that's the case, then you cannot love or concern oneself with wealth, possessions, family, etc. You prefaced today's session by talking about, or in response to what one of us said, either are you running away or to death? And, a lot of times you hear people say, well, I'm prepared to die. I welcome death because that means I'm going to be in a better, the hackneyed phrase, to be in a better place.
Right.
But here it's saying, well, really you should be fearing death. And I know what he's saying here is seems to be that, understand the consequences of death. This is where you will be judged ultimately, and it's you have the possibility of going to that better place and living eternally, but there's the opposite also as possible.
Correct, and that's where he's basically talking about the whole purpose of this, and that's why I did that kind of a preamble from Unseen Warfare, is all of this is about gaining virtue. All of this is about acquiring the gifts of the Holy Spirit to draw closer to God. And that is impossible for us to do unless we first empty ourselves. And so, in order to empty ourselves, we first have to basically say, okay, what is waiting for me if I don't do this? And so, this is one of the reasons why, and you've heard me say it in other classes before about the three different modes of Christianity: slave, mercenary, and friend. And so, the very first step of our Christian journey is slave. And why does a slave do what he does?
He has to.
He has to. Why? What's the recourse if he doesn't? Punishment. He's fearful of punishment. And so a slave does what he does, not necessarily because he wants to, but because he's terrified of what's going to happen. And so there are people that they do good, not for any other reason, but they're terrified of the punishment awaiting them. Versus a mercenary, and why does a mercenary do what he or she does?
Reward.
For reward, to get paid. So it's not about the matter of the deed being good or the relationship with the one that is giving the reward, but rather the reward itself, to say, well, I want the reward. Versus a friend. Why does a friend do what he or she does?
Out of love.
Out of love. And so the reason why we're looking at this here, Stephen, it's good that you point this out, this focus on death and the fear of death. Like you said, it's not about the idea of dyings per se. It's about what comes after. It's the idea of fear of judgment, the fear of what is going to happen to you. And so that is a stage one level, to basically say that you are like a slave worried about this. And so when St. John of the Ladder is saying that, you need to focus on death, he's basically saying be mindful of the judgment that is awaiting us. And so in order to do that, that will allow us to start thinking about other things. Now, let's focus a little bit more also on what this step is about, because in other classes that are doing the same material, kind of on the same journey that we are, this was a very hard chapter for them because of what it entails. So, was anything about what you read difficult to understand or take in?
I generally had trouble really comprehending what he was saying.
So what he's basically saying is that, our first step was to renounce the world, to basically no longer live in the world as we did. But this next step is to say, now we cannot have attachments. And what's really, really hard for people is to say, I cannot have attachments to my children, to my parents, to my siblings, to the worldly glory, to anything that I enjoy in this world, be it food, be it drink, be it carousing, that all of that I cannot have attachment to. That if I truly want to set off on this journey, then I have to renounce all of that. And a trick to doing that, St. John is saying us, is that instead of thinking about those things, you think about your death. To say, well, how can I have time to think about getting drunk when death is on the horizon, my judgment is on the horizon, and what have I done to prepare my soul for that? And so this idea of renouncing everything in your life, to get rid of everything that you are attached to, is not an easy step. Now, of course, as you read some of the particulars of this step, of course, it is speaking specifically to monasticism. The idea of complete renunciation of attachments, to not have any grip on worldly things, because what he's getting at is that if you do, then your destruction will be complete in the monastery. So before we go too much deeper, I want to give other people a chance to kind of talk about some things that they found interesting in the reading.
Well, going back to the confusion, verse 8, where he's talking about the straight and narrow versus the broad.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not clear, because on the one hand he says, we are not deceived into thinking that we are following the straight and narrow way, when in actual fact we are keeping to the wide and broad way.
Correct.
And so then it says the following will show you the narrow way. But he doesn't go into talking about, I'm not sure if he goes into talking about the broad way, which is what I assume that what we should be doing.
Well, actually, it's the opposite. The narrow way is the harder way. It's the way that we should be going. The broad way is basically the road to damnation is wide, the road to salvation is narrow. And so what he's saying is that if you are following the narrow path, then you are going to do well. And what he's basically saying is that it's possible to enter the monastic life. It's possible to enter the Christian journey and think that you are on the path of virtue when actually you're on the path of damnation. And so he's giving you examples of what it means to be in that narrow way, to mortify your stomach. So the very first step, and we're going to get to it obviously in future steps, is fasting, all night standing, prayer, water in moderation, short rations of bread, the purifying draught of dishonor, sneers, derision, insults, the cutting out of one's own will, patience and annoyances, unmurmuring endurance of scorn, disregard of insults, and the habit, when wronged, of bearing it sturdily, when slandered, of not being indignant, when humiliated, not being angry, when condemned, to be humble. Blessed are they who follow the way we have just described, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So what he's basically saying is that if you have ceased to have attachments, then that means that you are no longer attached to worldly glory and vindication. And so there are two examples that I'd like for us to focus on that amplify this. The first, of course, is St. Nectarios, who his entire life was maligned and lied about and chased from parish to parish to parish to parish as those lies continue to catch up to him and follow after him. And what's interesting is at no point did St. Nectarios say, wait a minute, this is a lie. I'm not like this. How can you think this about me? He just endured it and kept going. But perhaps the greatest example of this as a person that is walking this narrow path is a nun who, in her desire to renounce the world, was very, very clever. Have you all heard the story of Saint Theodora?
No.
Anybody? Okay. So Saint Theodora was a very beautiful young girl who, more than anything, she wanted to give herself to God. She wanted to be a monastic, and her father did not want that. He wanted her to have a good life, to be married, to have children, and so he arranged for a very nice man to be her husband. And so they got married, and on their wedding night, she snuck out the window, ran away. And knowing that her father knew what her desire was to be a nun, she knew that she could not go to a convent to join a sisterhood. So what did she do?
That's right, I remember.
She disguised herself as a man. Instead of saying that her name was Theodora, she said, well, I'm Theodore. And so she enlisted as a young man, and obviously with monasticism, you're not, seeing each other undressed because everything is so modest. And so he went on his journeys as a monk named Theodore. And so what happened at one point was the monk Theodore was tasked with escorting a rich banker's daughter on a journey. And this rich banker's daughter was attracted to Theodore, thinking that this feminine monk was just a very handsome and beautiful monk. And so she wanted to have relations with Theodore the monk. Well, of course, Theodore the monk rebuffed her, said, no, I've given myself to God. There's no way that I can do that. And so he ran off and left her. Well, she was upset, so she went and slept with someone else and got pregnant. And then she showed up at the monastery and said, "This baby, it's not mine. I refuse it. It's Theodore's child." So Theodore had relations with me on our journey, and it's his baby. Now, Theodore could have at any point said, "Yeah, that's impossible." And instead, didn't say anything. Raised the child as his own. And so this child grew up thinking that his father was this great sinner. And eventually, the young boy joined the monastery himself. And eventually, the girl's father, by girl I mean Theodora, and her husband, who had been looking for her everywhere for years, somehow came to that monastery and to pray. And so Theodora recognized it. Now, by this time, after so many years of fasting, she did not resemble what she did before. So she was waiting on them uh, in the guest room, and they said, "Oh, we just can't find Theodora. We can't find Theodora. It's been years and years and years." And she said, at this juncture, she's dead. You have to accept that. The girl that you looked for, she's dead. She died and gone. What would be more beneficial to you is to renounce this life, join the monastery, and pray for her and for yourselves." And so her father and her husband said, "You know what? Fine, that's actually a good idea." And so they joined the monastery. Not many years later, Theodora dies. And as they are preparing her body for burial, everyone is thinking, "Oh, what a sinful, sinful man. You know, he had to live with his sin of the child that he begot because of fornication." And then as they're preparing the body for burial, well, the the truth came out. And then suddenly everyone in the monastery was just weeping and beside themselves because they recognized that at no point did Theodora, this saintly person, ever insist on her innocence, because she had achieved complete detachment of will, glory, and vindication. She didn't need it because she had achieved virtue. So that could only happen through detachment. Does that make sense? That's the narrow way. That's a way that's really hard, and that's why it's narrow, because the broad way is easy. It's easy to say, "Well, I'm going to be justified. I'm going to demand on my way." Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Good example.
All right. Who else? What was your thought on the concept of renunciation of children and parents and family? This one is what was very difficult for other groups. Especially within Greek culture, there's almost like a worship of our children and our parents. That they are the number one priority, they are the number one concern. The thought of being without them is just unconscionable. And yet, St. John of the Ladder is telling us that we need to renounce our attachments to them. To no longer be latchkey kids and to no longer have severe attachment to our own children. What does that mean exactly? What is he getting at?
Well, if I may, I guess in these first two movements, these first two steps of the ladder, um, renouncing the world, detaching ourselves from the things of the world, I guess I picture it as um, it, when we're in the world where we I think specifically of something that's said in Romans 1 about how the attributes of God should be clear to us in all of creation.
Mm-hmm.
But in our fallenness, we see things as things. We see them as things existing in themselves, and we don't see them as somehow showing us or pointing us the way to God. And so Father Alexander Schmemann says the world is opaque to us in this way. We don't see the light of God in things the way that we should, because things are just things now. And so when you said that, we have this tendency to worship our children, to worship our parents, I think that's what the monk in these two steps is trying exactly to do. He's taking this really radical approach to say, I refuse to see the world just as an end in itself. Everything is supposed to point its way to God. So if we just think of our children and we worship our children, we think of our parents and worship our parents, we're not bringing ourselves from the thing and moving closer to God.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. And there is a place, I can't remember if it's further in the ladder, where they talk about, like, it was a mother-daughter duo that both joined the comet at the exact same time. And they were forbidden to talk to one another. They were in two cells side by side, but they were forbidden to talk to one another because the idea was that relationship needed to change from mother-daughter to sisters in the monastery. And what does that mean? It means exactly what Dr. Ed is talking about, the idea of putting the priority on God. And it's impossible to do that when you've made false idols out of everything else. And this extreme measure, because you're right, Dr. Ed, this is, an extreme measure, is basically trying to get us to wrap our mind around the idea that we're not saying don't love your parents and don't love your children. What we're trying to say is that you need to love God just a little bit more. That God needs to be the ultimate priority. Otherwise, you've got attachments to this world that you're not able to do. And he says in another place, if you, in part 11, if anyone thinks he is without attachment to some object but is grieved at its loss, then he is completely deceiving himself. Now, how many times do we see when someone loses, be it a parent or a friend, and they're at the funeral, they're inconsolable? I'm not talking about normal grief. I'm talking about absolutely unconsolable. That attachment is not healthy. Now,
like people sometimes have left the church because they're so distraught about losing someone, maybe even a child, and somehow would leave the church because of it, like ignoring God.
Correct. The idea that somehow, because God did not grant me this, like Dr. Ed was saying, this thing that I desire, that somehow that means that God isn't real, doesn't exist, and is not present with me. And that, of course, is a lie. This is one of the reasons why I opened with the reading from Unseen Warfare, in which we understand that even our tribulations are from God, and they're always meant to help us, bring us closer to Him. And if we're focusing only on our attachments to this world, then we are losing sight of our true priority. And this is one of the reasons why we, in another place, within this step, he talks about how there are individuals that, seemed virtuous, seemed pious when they were in the lay life because they were getting watered, and he was very graphic with sewage and manure because basically they were being good and virtuous, not because of the virtue of being good, not because of getting closer to God, but because of the idol of vainglory, of being seen as pious. Where it's not pious, but pietistic, because they enjoyed the praise of men saying, oh, you're so wonderful, you're so good, you should be a monk. And that's why he said when they go to the desert and it's arid and dry, they wither up and die because there's nothing feeding that ego. And this is one of the reasons why we started with the beginning talking about how if we're actually thinking about death, how we will renounce all these things. And then he kind of closes on verse 12. If young people who are prone to the desires of physical love and to luxurious ways wish to enter the monastic life, Let them exercise themselves in all fasting and prayer, and persuade themselves to abstain from all luxury and vice, lest their last state be worse than the first. This harbor provides safety, but also exposes one to danger. Those who sail spiritual seas know this, but it is a pitiful sight to behold those who have survived peril at sea suffering shipwreck in harbor. What do you think he's getting at there? What he's essentially saying is that if we engage on this journey of spiritual warfare and we do it with attachments, then we are going to end in a ruinous state. That we will be basically destroyed in the journey. Because you can go through the motions, as it were. You can, quote unquote, acquire the virtues, even though they're fake. But if you have attachments, then it's all going to be for naught. You will literally fall apart. Because what this journey does is it exposes you to the enemy. And this is why when it says, lest their last state be worse than the first, this is referring to when Jesus Christ said about a person that exorcises a demon, and the house of the body is swept clean. And what does the demon do? He goes out to the lonely place and then returns with 7 of its fellows and makes a nest home inside the person because it is familiar to the demon. And the last state is worse than the first. So what does that mean exactly? It means that if we go into spiritual life and we try to empty ourselves, but we don't fill it with the right things, fill it with virtue, truly empty ourselves of attachments, then what we're basically doing is giving the enemy a place to make home, to roost inside of us. Because if we take this pietistic journey, then it's a double-edged sword to us. Because it reveals in us our weaknesses and exposes us to extreme danger because we are engaging in actual warfare with the enemy. Now, as we're going to continue, though, it's impossible to acquire virtue without that journey. As we read in Unseen Warfare, you can't pray for patience and not expect to go through tribulations to earn that patience.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Would you also say, in this, when we're talking about this, what was that, 11 or verse, the 12th verse? I mean, essentially what's happening is self-deception.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're deceiving yourself, I mean, what do you think it's possible to deceive God? I don't think so.
And that's exactly it, is that you're lying to yourself thinking that this is going to be somehow an easier journey. And one of the things that we see also too, which was in the previous step as well, was this idea that somehow you're going to be thinking that, oh, well, the other way is better, or this way is better, because you're just constantly exposing yourself to different ideas and not detaching yourself of that. I believe it was in talking about worldly desires. And I was looking for that for verse 2, where he's using the analogy of when Peter said, let me go bury my father, and Christ said, let the dead bury their own. In other words, you can be alive and spiritually dead. So the idea that basically, if you're not, then you're already dead. And not in a good way. You're not dead to the passions, you're dead to feeling anything, to being able to experience anything. The only way forward is life.
I'm not quite understanding. When he says suffered me first to go there because he wants to bury his father, what is he saying? For him not to bury his father?
Correct. Jesus Christ said to him, leave the dead to bury their own. And this is analogous to basically tell us that we have to move towards life, not death. Well, of course it is. That's hard because he's basically, I mean, how hard would that be to say, you can't go bury your father?
Yeah, I mean,
But that's what Jesus Christ said to him.
But he's also saying that, there are plenty of other people who are around who could bury him. And who are they? Those are the people who are not on the right path.
Exactly. And so Jesus is telling Peter and all of us that we must renounce these things. Do not have attachments. You need to focus on what is important, and that is life.
Well, this is not the first time that Jesus told the apostles to, detach themselves from their family.
Correct. He said, anyone who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone that is not willing to take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. So we are essentially told to shoulder up and march.
Father, on 3, where it talks about the demons, that after our renunciation of the world, the demons suggest that we should. Oh wait, that's not what I was looking for. Where it says that the demons tell us about our fam, like our parent. Oh, there it is. 10. On 10, I was thinking. After our unification with the demons, inflame our hearts by reminding us of our parents and brethren. So were they saying that we should? I'm not quite sure what they're trying to say.
Well, that verse 10 is particularly talking about monks and nuns who have renounced the world and engaged in this journey to stay at the monastery. And so he's saying in that particular verse about how it would feel to basically say, well, you've got to go back. Remember your family. We have response, but if you're a layperson, you're in the world. So that renunciation that he's talking about is specifically to monastics. But keep in mind that even within that verse, the idea of not making them idols is present when it says that let us inflame ourselves with remembrance of the eternal fire, so that by reminding ourselves of this, we may quench the untimely fire of our heart. In other words, focusing on other people. And what this really means, though, is, again, I've seen this many, many times where people come to me and say, Father, I'm worried about my brother. Father, I'm worried about my kids. Father, I'm worried about my parents. I'm on the way to salvation, but I'm worried they're going to hell. And this is attachment. You're attached to them. Instead of recognizing that in order to help them, in order to truly save them, you've got to let go. You have to not be attached. Save yourself, and Christ will save them.
So are you saying you should just pray for them? You shouldn't be you shouldn't worry about it? Or what are they trying to say? You shouldn't worry about it?
It's not about worrying about it. It's about the idea of saying that basically you're focusing on them instead of focusing on Christ.
Well, the thing is, parents have a tendency to want to solve things. So what you're saying is we shouldn't be doing that.
The idea is that first and foremost, you need to save yourself. That if you're looking to your children to say, oh my gosh, I got to save them, I got to save them, I got to save them. First of all, that's the wrong attitude. God is the one that saves, not you, not me. And so you have to renounce that attachment and say, I will focus on my salvation with Christ, and he will fill everything else. That does not mean...
When the plane is going down and the sign says, put on your oxygen mask first, and then you can help someone else.
That's doctor, that is exactly it.
Excellent analogy.
You're not equipped. You don't have the ability to do it otherwise. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of times they'll tell novices, especially when they were going to this monastery, the monastery of St. Sava in the Palestinian desert, was that you were not allowed to write or have any interaction with your parents for 7 years to ensure that you had cut off relations.
This is one of the...
this is the journey. This is one of the reasons why monks, almost no monk that I've ever heard of, has the name they were baptized with. It's always a new name. Why? To renounce that attachment to the previous world. You are no longer that person. You are something new. You are different. You have cut yourself off from that. And this is a very, very hard thing for us to do. It's very, very hard for us to say, okay, I can't focus on that. I need to focus on this. And once you've achieved that, then salvation will come to them. Not because you are seeking that out to do it, but because the opportunities will present themselves and the spirituality within you will wash off over them. Notice how in the story that we just used of Theodora, you don't think that she was worried about her husband or her father, who she had to know were looking for her and essentially wasting years of their life trying to find her? That was her journey. And she had to detach herself from that. And yet God, who knows all things and does all things for our benefits, our spiritual growth, made the opportunity happen, not to reunite them in the sense of, oh, okay, well, now they're going to be husband and wife and leave the monastery, but for them to be saved. And it wasn't by her, pleading on behalf as the wife and daughter, but just as a spiritual being, someone who was praying for them and offering sage advice. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
I mean, by a similar token, you could say here when she detached herself from her marriage,
Mm-hmm.
she was detaching herself from the possibility of having a child.
Mm-hmm.
And yet through this situation that she encountered with this, whoever she was, she wound up having a child.
Correct. It's very much a very thy will be done. Her motherhood was thrown off to be a monastic, and yet it was thrust on her. And instead of saying no, 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 she was okay. This is what God has given me. You're absolutely right. She detached herself from motherhood, and yet it was brought back to her by God, which shows us again that our journey, if we treat it this way, brings us to salvation.
But if we bring ourselves back from the monastic life, which none of us are in,
Right.
and we're in a situation, just take a situation that all parents go through at some point, where your child is very sick. Now we can't just ignore our sick children. I think what you're getting at is if we're right with God, then we will know better how to care for our children.
Correct. And that's the idea. If you have emotional detachment, that doesn't mean that you're an automaton. This isn't about becoming a robot. And that's what, as we journey deeper down the ladder, or up the ladder, I guess would be a better verbiage. You're exactly right. And it's exactly like Dr. Ed was saying, like, you can't put the oxygen mask on the child until you've got oxygen on yourself, that you are better equipped to deal with the situation, to be there for your kids, to be a better father, a better mother, if you do these things. That's not a matter of, detaching yourself completely, because Jesus Christ had attachment to us. If we read Song of Songs, it's talking about Jesus Christ as a lover who desires us most earnestly. So this isn't about, becoming robots or something that's not authentic. It's about detaching yourself from idol worship and allowing yourself to see things as they appropriately are. For example, within children, what did Eve say when she received her child? God has given me this child. She didn't say, I begot this child, I made this child. She said, God has given me this child. And so when we look at our children as gifts from God,
Right.
and as our primary role is to raise those children to be brought back to God, then that is the proper context. That is the lack of attachment. Instead of having the attachment say, well, I want my child to be, a very successful doctor and wealthy and to have his own children and yada, yada, yada. Instead of saying the primary focus of my parenthood is their salvation, then we need to look no further than St. Sophia and her 3 daughters. Because St. Sophia, in my estimation, would be seen as the perfect parent, despite the fact that none of her children lived past the age of 13. So she was attached, but she wasn't attached, if that makes sense. In other words, she was not attached to their future as saying, well, they're going to marry rich men, they're going to have their own children, they're going to travel the world. She didn't have an attachment to that. Her attachment was their love and understanding of Christ, their Savior, and God. Does that make sense? The difference?
It would be, I mean, it would be very hard for us to try to be like that, though.
Well, that's the narrow path of salvation. And that's why it's really, really hard. And that's why it's...
Dr. and Mrs. Tobias, you must have done something right.
It was the Holy Spirit.
That's right.
Okay.
I always say that because Father Dimitri the minute he could walk and talk and point, he was, his happiness time was behind the altar. He as an altar boy, but even when he was just a toddler and everything, the earliest words out of his mouth were he was going to be a priest. So God, I don't think we had anything to do with it really. God, the Holy Spirit entered him early.
But in a way, this is, we'll segue off of this because I don't want this to be about me. This is about the Ladder of Divine Ascent. But one of the things that my mom and I saw in a seminar by Father George Dragas was that there are a lot of parents that do not want their children to become priests or monks or nuns because there is this lack of prestige attached to it. And so the parents have to have enough detachment to say, okay, I'm not attached to that future for my child. I'm okay with my child being, a poor village priest if that's what God wants my child to do. So there is that level of detachment. And all of us in our lives can see that level of detachment, which is why if we look to verse 4, where it says, let us listen to what the Lord said to the young man who had fulfilled nearly all the commandments. One thing thou lackest. Sell what you have and give to the poor and become a beggar who receives alms from others. In other words, each of us has to give up not just the riches of this life, but that which holds us back, the things that we are attached to. That's how we can get to the eye of the needle in that particular gospel passage. By getting rid of our attachments, our earthly attachments, and the glories that come with them. Okay, so next week we're going to go on to exile or pilgrimage. And that'll be, actually, you know what, I take it back. Next week we'll be on break because it's the day before Thanksgiving. And even though Thanksgiving is canceled, people will still be doing their... People will still be cooking their dinners on Wednesday night. So we will resume the week after with step 3.
But good luck finding a small group. Three or four people.
Well, we'll all do the best we can and be thankful to God regardless.
Well, I hope the Illinois police aren't going to be knocking on people's door, checking things out.
They're not even doing that. They're not even doing that in Oregon.
All right. Well, God bless you all. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present all truth and filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse of every sin, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. God bless you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful night.